مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أرقام صاعقة. هناك أكثر من 45 ألف شخص يقتلون بسبب الأسلحة كل عام في أمريكا، وهو ما يساوي 20 ضعف العدد الذين قتلوا في أحداث 11 سبتمبر، وستة أضعاف عدد الأميركيين الذين قتلوا في أطول حربين في التاريخ الأميركي، حربي العراق وأفغانستان. مهما كان موقفك بشأن سياسة الأسلحة، فالأرقام فظيعة، وهو أمر تتميز فيه أمريكا عن بقية البلدان في إرجاء العالم في هذا الخصوص. مؤخرا وبعد المأساة التي حصلت في مدرسة يوفالدي في ولاية تكساس، قام الكونغرس بأمر لم يستطيع فعله طوال 20 عاما لقد دعم قوانين الأسلحة، ولا يزال مباحا في الولايات المتحدة أن يشتري المواطن سلاحا حربيا أو حتى 100 مسدس، إلا أن القيود أصبحت أكثر تشددا بعد أن شاهد ملايين الأشخاص تلك الصور الرهيبة للأطفال المقتلون في حين الشرطة لم تحرك ساكنا للردع القاتل. لماذا الآن؟ وكيف استطاعت مجزرة تكساس من إحراز تقدم تشريعي بينما المجازر السابقة من كولومباين إلى ساندي هوك ومن بيتسبرغ إلى بافالو لم تستطيع فعل ذلك؟ وهل سيحدث ذلك فرقا للتحدث عن الرقابة على حياز السلاح في أمريكا؟ يسرني أن أستضيف ريك بيرت وماكس جرينوود. Welcome back to داخل Washington. It happens in America with mind-numbing frequency. Mass shootings, killings of kids, worshipers, tourists, coast to coast, small town, big city, it's all the same. Over the summer, Congress passed its first gun control legislation in decades. Will it make a difference? What was this all about? And where do we need to go to try to prevent future massacres? To discuss this issue, I'm delighted to welcome Rick Burt and Max Greenwood. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me this morning. Let's start with some of the statistics that at least set a basis for this conversation about guns in America. So the general number that people tend to cite is 45,000 gun deaths in our country, generally, over the last number of years. But how many guns are there floating around in American society? Rick, do we know?
You know, I would say from our perspective at Students Against Destructive Decisions, the organization I represent, we don't fully know for all the reasons that we're going to talk about here today. Lapses in legislation, a market that doesn't fully regulate, lots of issues that go with this. We're taking the position of looking at also the mental health side of the equation, how we can look at how policy can intersect with gun control, and how, you know, from our perspective of working with young people, working with middle school, high school, and college students, how we can work to keep them safe.
So when we look at, let's say, that number 45,000, which people tend to use, Max, do we have a basic sense of how that breaks down between accidents, suicides, murders, criminal acts, that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, I think we do. It's a little bit hard to report simply because a lot of this is self-reported. Our system is frankly a little bit arcane, a little bit dated. So, you know, I'd say, look, the vast majority of these are accidents. There is a significant number of suicides, but we are seeing a rise in person against person violence.
I mean, we tend to focus, as you said, on mass shootings, but most deaths are accidental. Do we know what types of firearms, Rick, tend to be involved in gun deaths? Are we talking revolvers, rifles, AR-15 submachine guns?
Yeah, from the data that we've seen, it's a little bit of everything. A lot of this goes back to access and what individuals can access. Students who tragically choose to take their own life do tend to look for that family weapon that might already be in the house. So if that's some sort of handgun or revolver or something like that, in some more limited instances, some family hunting rifles. Obviously, here in the U.S., hunting is a part of the equation as well, particularly for our more rural states and communities.
All right, now that we've sort of set the predicate here, Max, you referred to earlier the legislation that was passed. Before we get into the details of that, let's explain to our viewers a unique feature of American constitutional life called the Second Amendment. What is it, and why is it such an emotive issue for so many Americans?
Sure. So the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution really says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, that's been interpreted in a handful of different ways over the years or centuries. But look, the way the Supreme Court has interpreted it is that you have an individual right as an American to own a weapon, to keep it in your home, to keep it on your person in some cases. So this is really a third rail of U.S. politics. It's been an issue, really, I'd say, starting in the late 1960s. It is kind of when this whole debate got kicked off. Before then, there was a general understanding that, well, yes, of course you can keep a gun, but exactly what that meant was a little bit less clear. People didn't think about it so much. What you start to see in the late 1960s, the early 1970s, is a real push to expand gun ownership. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, really transforms at that point into a just political powerhouse, a lobbying powerhouse that pushes, against any sort of new curbs, new restrictions on gun rights, and in some cases has tried to roll those back. So, look, the Second Amendment is I'd say one of the more complicated features of American politics and American government. It's something that there's very little consensus on. So, it becomes a question of how far can the government go to restrain firearm use, restrain firearm ownership, and what's in the best interest of public safety.
All right, so that's the context in which public policy is made on gun ownership, gun restriction, gun registration, even gun carrying here in the United States. I'm sorry, Rick, did you want to say something about this?
Well, just very quickly, I think what also makes this interesting, and Max alluded to this, but I think it's important for our viewers to understand the concept of federalism, and that there's nuance of federal policy laws that would apply all across the United States, but also the beliefs and the political cultures that vary so greatly from state to state. We've talked a little bit about some of those states that have been passing gun reform, but we've also seen, at least from our desk, some states taking either administrative action or some policies to lessen gun control as well. And so I think, it can't be understated just how nuanced the political culture of each state is, where essentially you have, 50 state legislatures and gubernatorial environments that are operating under this umbrella of the United States as well. So I think that's also important to highlight just how complex the system is.
Well, actually, you're jumping ahead to a very interesting question that I wanted to get. No, it's fine. Which is how the Supreme Court has gotten into even states' rights on this issue, with a major decision that came out earlier this year, overturning a New York state law on restricting, gun ownership, and how that plays into our national discussion of this issue. Max, can you take a minute and explain what happened with the Supreme Court?
Sure. So, this case up in New York, it's similar to a case from well over a decade ago, Heller versus the District of Columbia. And look, cities, states will try to implement their own rules and regulations surrounding gun possession, where you can carry it, if you can carry it openly or concealed. So the New York state law in question effectively prohibited people from openly carrying a handgun in public in the city without a permit that had certain conditions attached to it. So for example, if you held a job that required you to transport a large amount of money or valuable product, jewelry, for example, you could ask for a permit that would allow you to carry that handgun, for protection of yourself and your property. What the Supreme Court said is that no, the state actually does not have the ability to put that regulation in place. You cannot attach conditions to what is otherwise a constitutional right. The argument in question is whether or not there should be conditions, whether or not the government can say when you can and can't bear weapons in public, bear firearms in public. A similar situation played out, I believe it was 2007 in Washington, D.C. Over handgun ownership. Dick Heller, the plaintiff in that case, or the petitioner, was suing the District of Columbia over a law that prohibited handgun ownership. The Supreme Court said essentially all or nothing. There's nothing wrong with owning a handgun. It's protected by your Second Amendment right. And that's really played into our current understanding of gun ownership in the United States and what our rights are. So I think that was a disappointment to a lot of gun control advocates, but that's really what started defining the current situation we're in.
So if viewers who have been watching the show and listened to some of the explanations we had, for example, about the Supreme Court's decision on abortion, which was essentially to throw the issue back to the states, they may very well have a question, which is, well, if the abortion issue is supposed to be decided by the states, why is it that the Supreme Court says that states don't have the right to make up their own rules about this issue? And there, the answer is because there's a constitutional amendment that they interpret as providing a single national right to gun ownership. It is a complicated issue. And when we come back after the break, we're going to look at the specific legislation that Congress passed, why it did it now, and will it make a difference on this major national problem of gun violence in just a moment. It's hot, really hot. So wherever you are, that likely means lots of time either at the beach or the pool. And that means lots of time available for summer reading. The options, of course, are endless, but I'm going to recommend 3 novels, each representing a different genre. Each of these was eventually made into wildly successful movies, but summer is the time you can go back in time, get the paperback, and actually read the original. First, nothing says sweeping, majestic crime novel like the granddaddy of them all, The Godfather, the 1969 novel by Mario Puzo that gave birth to the Godfather dynasty of books and films. This brilliant novel is absolutely chilling, which is precisely what you want on a sweltering day. Secondly, if you love mysteries, here too I recommend the master of the genre, in this case, the mistress, Agatha Christie. Pour a tall glass of a cool drink and read Murder on the Orient Express, and never trust anyone ever again. And speaking of mistresses, there is an entirely different genre of escapist literature fit for summer reading that is exemplified by The Devil Wears Prada by Lauren Weisberger, the fictionalized story of the deliciously miserable life at the height of Manhattan fashion. There's something for almost everyone here, and while there are fantastic new books coming out every week, these standards have stood the test of time. They will definitely not let you down. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. My guests today include Rick Burt. Rick is President and Chief Executive Officer of SADD, S-A-D-D, an advocacy group based here in Washington that works on behalf of students nationwide. Founded in 1991 to combat drunk driving, SADD found itself at the center of America's gun debate. Also joining us is Max Greenwood, a national politics reporter at The Hill, where he is covering the 2022 midterm elections. Previously, Max reported for USA Today and The Huffington Post. All right, Rick, after decades of inaction, Congress finally acted over the summer following the terrible events in Uvalde, Texas. What happened there, and why did it strike a nerve that so many other mass killings didn't to trigger congressional action?
It's a great question. Obviously, in this case, we had an elementary school that was victim to a horrific attack of a gunman who came in with the sole purpose to kill young children and staff members. And I think what we found ourselves at was the perfect synergies of a very violent and very visceral. By that I mean a very emotional pull of seeing 20 plus individuals, especially young children, who were killed. Even though this is truly an epidemic in our country, where this happens almost daily, to have such a large quantity and such an emotional pull, particularly in a state like Texas, which has been historically very open on gun control and had been very more conservative in securing those rights for individuals. I think many parties saw this as an opportunity to renew that discussion, which is, as Max so wisely stated, has been going for many years in our country. So I think it's a recipe of the right moment, the right people. Unfortunately, a horrific tragedy that we have to stop if we want to keep our kids safe.
So, Max, the legislation that was passed didn't actually restrict gun ownership. What did it do?
Well, so it did a few things, and I think it's worth starting off with the fact that this was a compromise legislation. This it had the support of, I believe, 14 Republicans in the Senate. So look, naturally, some stuff is going to be cut out of that. But really, what we can look at that it has done is it incentivizes states, first of all, to implement what we call red flag laws, and these are laws that allow law enforcement to intervene and temporarily confiscate the firearms of individuals that are judged to be a danger to themselves or others. And several states already have these laws in place. The idea is that it provides financial incentives for other states to take up similar laws. It's essentially crisis intervention, I would say. It also toughens background checks and restrictions on young people between the ages of 18, 21, and 21 to purchase firearms. And really beyond that, it closes what we call the boyfriend loophole. So the boyfriend loophole is kind of this hole in US gun law where if an individual is convicted of domestic violence, they cannot own a firearm. That unfortunately has applied in the past to spouses and domestic partners, but not to boyfriends. So it's been a very alarming hole in US law. It aims to close that up. And the other thing that we see that they're still doing is setting aside more resources for school safety and mental health.
All right, Max Greenwood, Rick Burt, thank you so much for helping to explain this complex issue to our Middle Eastern viewers here on Dakhel, Washington. We just passed two milestones, one hopeful, one gruesome. The hopeful milestone was the 31st anniversary of Ukraine's independence, when it emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union to be a free democratic state. Of course, it has had its share of problems, from the aftershocks of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster to the deeply ingrained corruption that plagued successive governments. But it has been a free and democratic state nonetheless, and that is something to celebrate. The second milestone is gloomy. We just marked 6 months of warfare following the unprovoked Russian invasion of its Western neighbor. Numbers are hard to corroborate, but it appears more than 25,000 soldiers have been killed, about 2/3 Russian, 1/3 Ukrainian, plus another 15 to 25,000 Ukrainian civilians killed, many targets of a purposeful Russian strategy to terrorize the Ukrainian population. For numbers of wounded, multiply those numbers by 3. And for the number of refugees forced to flee their homes in Ukraine as a result of war, the staggering number is about 15 million. 7 million who left the country and 8 million who were displaced within it. That is more than 1/3 of the entire country of Ukraine. Before our very eyes, the megalomaniac who controls Russia is destroying an entire people. And even as he fails miserably on the battlefield, he is making terrible headway toward the goal of destroying the people of Ukraine. They will survive thanks to their remarkable resilience and determination, but they will be forever scarred by the experience. To be sure, they will survive only if the West continues to remain firm in its support. Part of this is military, and here the United States is nobly fulfilling its mission. Of course, this is a far cry from when Americans fought Iraqis to free Kuwait. In this war, America is arming Ukrainians to defend their own country as we build up NATO defenses around it. But the arms keep coming, and there is thankfully little America first debate about it. But the soft underbelly of the West is not the provision of military support to the Ukrainians. It's the willingness to endure economic and social hardship when the Russians turn off gas supplies come winter as a way to blackmail Europe to let the Ukrainians fend for themselves. Who to watch? Not the former communist states of Poland and the Baltics, whose people know what it means to suffer under the likes of the former KGB agent running the Kremlin. Rather, Germany and France are where the Russians have set their sights. The next couple of months before winter fully sets in are crucial. Now is the moment when our collective support for Ukraine must be firm, so that Kyiv enters the frigid cold in the best possible position on the battlefield. Nothing succeeds like success, and nothing will keep the Allies together more than the Ukrainians' successful defense of their country. Let's hope the people of Germany and France are willing to sacrifice a few degrees on their thermostats so the people of Ukraine don't have to shed more blood come spring. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن سياسة الرقابة على حيازة السلاح في أمريكا المنقسمة، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكراً وإلى اللقاء.